So what makes a good goal? Well, before we answer that, let me ask you another question. Are all goals created equal? What do you think? Listen, goals do differ in the type and the depth of learning our students experience. So let's take a look at the different types of goals and talk about the learning that takes place within each type. There are performance goals, and then we have learning goals. And each of these types address learning differently. And let's see what those differences are. We'll start with performance goals. Performance goals focus on the mathematical procedures only. These are the students will be able to statements. And under a performance goal, students are restricted to using just the procedure that's identified in the goal. Students are assessed based on their computational work only. Performance goals don't address the conceptual understanding that's required by our standards. On the other hand, learning goals focus on what students will understand from the lesson. The key word here is understand. The focus of the learning goal is to build conceptual understanding of the relationships that drive the procedures. And they also support procedural fluency and application. Under a learning goal, students are assessed through demonstrating both an understanding of the concept, explain or justify your reasoning, as well as through computational work. So learning goals support the procedural, the conceptual, and the application aspects of the standards. So here's an example of a performance goal. It says students will be able to use cross multiplication to find the missing value in problems in which quantities being compared are in a proportional relationship. This performance goal restricts students to one procedure, and that's cross multiplication, to find missing values in a proportion. This performance goal does not address conceptual understanding. That is, students don't need to know why cross multiplication works or have an understanding of what it means for quantities to be in a proportional relationship. Now let's take a look at a learning goal. This learning goal has two parts. The first part says students will understand that quantities that are in a proportional relationship grow at a constant rate. So the first part of the learning goal requires students to have an understanding of what it means for quantities to be in a proportional relationship. The second part says students will understand that there are three key strategies that can be used to solve problems of this type: scaling up, scale factor, and unit rate. So the second part is used to build students' understanding of those proportional relationships, as well as why cross multiplication works. This learning goal would be used as an introduction to proportional relationships. So students haven't seen proportions yet, they don't know anything about cross multiplication. Now let's compare these two goals. Under which one of these two goals would the deepest learning take place? We'd have to say the learning goal. So if we're talking about generating student thinking, if we're talking about the deepest learning, the learning goal addresses the deepest learning. The most thinking will take place under that learning goal. Now don't get me wrong here. Procedural fluency is important, and there is a place for procedural practice. But when we're talking about where the most learning is going to take place, that would be under the learning goal. Now let's compare these two goals to the standard that they align to, 7RP12. This standard says students will recognize and represent proportional relationships between quantities. A, decide whether two quantities are in a proportional relationship by testing equivalent ratios in a table, or graphing on a coordinate plane and observing whether the graph is a straight line through the origin. B, Identify the constant rate of proportionality in tables, graphs, equations, diagrams, and verbal descriptions of proportional relationships. C. Represent proportional relationships by equations. And D. Explain what a point xy on the graph of a proportional relationship means in terms of the situation, with special attention to the points 0, 0 and 1, 4, where r is the unit rate. Whew, I'm tired. This standard addresses both what students are to know and be able to do. It addresses their conceptual understanding along with their procedural fluency. So looking at these two goals, which one best supports the learning in the standard? It'd have to be the learning goal. The learning goal does the best job of supporting the learning in this standard. And even though the learning goal does not address the entire standard, the lesson that the learning goal supports would be the first in a series of lessons that work together to build students' understanding of this standard. And even though both of these goals align to this standard, the learning goal was written with the standard in mind. So we would say that this learning goal is a standards-based goal. Well, that was a lot, so let's move on. So here's another question. Are standards goals? Listen, some standards are focused enough to be a goal for a lesson. However, most standards require students' understanding to be built over time. It would take time to build our students' learning towards everything that standard requires. Case in point, 7RP12. We know it would be impossible for us to teach all of this in a single lesson, and it would be impossible for our students to learn all of that in a single lesson. So most of the time, standards are far too broad to be a learning goal for a lesson. Our learning goals, though, would need to address the learning of this standard, but in increments through a sequence of connected lessons that build that understanding over time. This means when we're developing the goals, we need to be clear about how the learning goals relate to the standards and how they build our students' understanding towards the rigor of the standard. In this next activity, we'll be comparing goals and discussing the learning that takes place in the goal to determine if it's a performance goal or a learning goal. After the activity, we'll take a look at writing effective goals. I'll meet you back here in a few.